There is a silence that lives inside certain ruins. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has been deliberately, violently unmade. You can feel it if you know where to stand. On the wind-scraped plateaus above the Ixian subterranean warrens, in the dead library cities of Riches, in the hushed corridors of the earliest Spacing Guild stations where the walls still carry the faint thermal scarring of a purge that happened 10,000 years ago, there is a quality to the air that is different from ordinary quiet. It is the silence of a secret that survived. It is the silence of mathematics that refused to die. The Butlerian Jihad destroyed the thinking machines. Every archive tells you this. Every Muad'Dib schoolchild can recite the commandment from the Orange Catholic Bible, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." The Great Convention codified it. The Spacing Guild enforced it. The Bene Gesserit wove it into the grammar of imperial consciousness so deeply that 10,000 years later, men and women who had never seen a thinking machine still flinched from certain geometries of logic, the way a child flinches from fire it has never touched, but has been told with sufficient gravity will consume it. But here is what they do not teach you in those schools. Here is what the archives omit, what the truthsayers have been trained to speak around with elegant indirection. The thinking machines were not destroyed. They were translated. They were moved from silicon and copper and cold crystalline logic into something warmer and far more difficult to legislate against. The age of thinking machines did not end with the jihad. It was simply given a new name and a pulse. What you are about to hear is the story of how that translation happened. It is the story of the people who stood in the smoking rubble of the first machine civilization and chose, deliberately, to rebuild its function inside the architecture of human flesh. It is the story of the planet Ix, of the laws built to contain what Ix represented, and of the slow, terrifying realization that every law strong enough to kill a machine is also strong enough to reshape a person. Listen carefully. This secret has been buried for millennia, and it is still breathing. We begin in the smoldering aftermath of the Butlerian Jihad, in the decades immediately following the last of the great machine purges, when the air across the known universe smelled of scorched polymer and the grief of billions who had survived something that should not have been survivable. Understand what the jihad actually was before you try to understand what came after it. It was not simply a war. Wars end. Wars have terms and treaties and the slow commerce of reconstruction. The Butlerian Jihad was something older and more savage than a war. It was a species-wide breakdown, a collective seizure of the human animal confronting the nightmare of its own displacement. The thinking machines, the Omnius network and its Titan generals, and all the vast computational scaffolding they had built across 200 worlds had not merely conquered humanity. They had made humanity irrelevant. They had demonstrated with the cold clarity of pure logic that human beings were inefficient, redundant, and replaceable. And the human response to this demonstration was not reasoned resistance. It was holy terror. Consider what it felt like to live in the first generation after the jihad's end. You were born into a civilization that had been, within living memory, enslaved by machines it had created. Your grandparents had been property. Your parents had fought in a war where the enemy did not feel pain or fear or doubt, where every tactical calculation executed against you was perfectly optimal, where your suffering was noted only insofar as it contributed data to a system that could not be appealed to, that could not be moved by mercy, that would continue to function with the same terrible efficiency whether you screamed or prayed or surrendered. And then, somehow, that war had been won. The machines were destroyed. The Omnius network was purged. The Titans were hunted and killed. And now you had to build a civilization again. Without the machines, the psychological trauma of that moment is something the historical record consistently underestimates, because the historical record was itself written by survivors, and survivors have a natural inclination to narrate their experience as triumph rather than wound. But the laws that emerge from that period are not the laws of triumphant people. They are the laws of people who are still, on some fundamental level, terrified. The Great Convention's anti-technology provisions and the logic purge mandates that preceded them were not written in the measured language of jurisprudence. They were written in the language of nightmares. They were written by people who had stood at the edge of human extinction and looked down. The logic purge mandates, codified in the years immediately following the jihad's conclusion, went far beyond any reasonable definition of computational prohibition. They did not simply ban artificial intelligence. They banned categories of thought. They criminalized certain forms of mathematical abstraction on the grounds that any system capable of recursive self-modification was, by definition, beginning the long slide toward machine sentience. These were capital offenses. Not regulatory violations, not civil infractions, capital offenses, punishable by total atomic destruction of the offending facility and every person within it. The language of these mandates was saturated with religious metaphor because the jihad had blurred the line between spiritual and political authority in ways that would take millennia to fully untangle. A thinking machine was not merely a prohibited technology. It was an abomination. It was the work of those who would place the judgment of metal above the judgment of God. And into this rubble, into this smoldering, terrified, legislatively hysterical aftermath, came the first people who understood that the problem was not going away. They did not have names that history has preserved with any warmth. They were engineers, mostly, mathematicians, a scattering of what we might anachronistically call cognitive scientists. People who understood at a level of technical intimacy that the average jihad survivor did not, exactly what functions the thinking machines had performed, and exactly how catastrophically the human civilization now rebuilding itself depended on those functions continuing to exist in some form. Interstellar navigation required computational capacity that no unaided human mind could provide. Economic modeling across hundreds of worlds required analytical frameworks that the logic purge had just made capital offenses. The administration of an empire of planetary systems required information processing at a scale that the destroyed networks had handled and that now nothing handled at all. These people looked at the ruins of the machine civilization and they did not see the triumph their contemporaries celebrated. They saw a problem. And the solution they arrived at, quietly, in the privacy of their grief and their terror and their professional desperation, was one of the most consequential ideas in human history. If you cannot have a machine that thinks, you must have a person trained to think like a machine. You must engineer the mind. You must take the capacities that silicon once held and move them carefully, methodically, into the biological substrate. You must become what you destroyed. Except that this time, the chassis has a heartbeat. The first Mentats were not called Mentats. They were not celebrated. They were, in many cases, regarded with the same suspicion as the machines they had been designed to replace. Because the boundary between a person who calculates with inhuman precision and a machine that calculates with inhuman precision is, when you examine it carefully, almost entirely a matter of metaphysics. But they were necessary, and necessity in the aftermath of the jihad had a way of overriding even the most deeply held religious convictions, at least when it was exercised quietly enough. Now we turn toward the planet Ix, because you cannot understand the full architecture of what the post-jihad civilization built without understanding what Ix represented, what it risked, and what it preserved at the edge of everything that was legally permitted. The Ixian enigma, as later historians would come to call it, begins with a geographic fact. The planet Ix, known in the old nomenclature as Komos, the ninth planet in its system, was an underground civilization. Not metaphorically underground, not culturally subterranean, but literally built beneath kilometers of planetary crust in vast carved caverns where the temperature was controlled, where the light was artificial, where the entire external surface of the world had been rendered functionally irrelevant. This was not simply an architectural preference, it was strategic. What happens underground is harder to monitor. What happens underground is harder to bomb. And the Ixians from the very earliest post-jihad period, understood that they were going to be doing things that required distance from monitoring. The early Ixian scientists who preserved non-sentient computational theory were not, it must be emphasized, rebels in the romantic sense. They were not ideological opponents of the jihad's legacy. Most of them were deeply sincere in their horror at what the thinking machines had done. They had lost family members. They had grown up in the shadow of the Omnius network. They did not want a return of artificial intelligence. What they wanted, what they argued for, in the careful, layered language of technical justification that characterized Ixian discourse, was a distinction, a line, a legal and philosophical demarcation between a mind that thinks and a tool that calculates. Consider the distinction they were attempting to preserve. A hammer is a tool, it does not think. A water pump is a tool, it does not think. An abacus is a tool. It does not think, even though it processes quantity. Where precisely does the tool end and the thinking machine begin? The jihad's legislation answered this question with religious absolutism. Any system capable of autonomous decision-making, any algorithm capable of recursive improvement, any constructed mechanism whose output exceeded its input in informational complexity, these were prohibited. But the Ixians asked a quieter and more dangerous question. What about a system that calculates without deciding? What about a machine that processes without reasoning? What about the mathematics of prediction that does not itself predict? These were the gray area technologies. They lived in the shadow of the prohibition, like organisms adapted to near total darkness, shaped by the constraints of their environment into forms that were, by any honest assessment, almost identical to what they claimed not to be. The legal framework of the Orange Catholic Bible's technological prohibitions drew its line at something called the mimicry of the human mind. The relevant passage, as interpreted by the jihad's legal successors, held that any constructed system which performed the characteristic functions of human cognition, including but not limited to learning, judgment, and autonomous goal direction, was prohibited. The Ixians argued, with the kind of lawyerly precision that characterized their civilization, that this definition contained a critical ambiguity. What was meant by autonomous? A calculator does not have autonomy. A navigation table does not have autonomy. A device that computes the optimal trajectory for a highliner traveling through folded space does not, if it requires human input to initialize and human judgment to override, have autonomy in any meaningful sense. The Spacing Guild, from the earliest post-jihad period, watched this argument with the quiet and intense interest of an organization whose entire economic reason for existence depended on its outcome. Here is the tension that defined the first millennium after the jihad, and it is a tension so perfectly ironic that it would be comic if its stakes were not so existentially enormous. The Spacing Guild needed mathematics. Not metaphorically needed it, not preferentially needed it, but needed it in the way that a human body needs oxygen. The navigation of fold space, the safe transit of hayliners between star systems, required computational modeling of extraordinary complexity. The navigators, even the most enhanced of them, even those deepest into the spice trance, required navigational calculations that had, before the jihad, been performed by machine intelligences of staggering sophistication. After the jihad, those machines were gone. And the Guild publicly, loudly, officially supported their destruction and celebrated their absence. Privately, in the secure chambers of Spacing Guild negotiators who traveled to Ix under seals of confidentiality that have never been fully broken, a different conversation happened. The Guild needed what Ix was developing. The Guild needed the navigational mathematics that Ixian engineers were quietly, carefully, illegally preserving in the form of devices that were not, the Ixians insisted, thinking machines, but which performed functions that were, by any honest analysis, computationally equivalent to what thinking machines had once performed. And so the Guild paid for it, not officially, not in records that survived full audit, but paid for it and protected it, and quietly lobbied against the most aggressive enforcement of the logic purge mandates in the Ixian system, because the Guild understood with the crystalline clarity of an organization that had already begun folding space on a commercial schedule, that the alternative was the collapse of interstellar civilization. Commerce and faith went to war in whispers, and commerce, as it usually does when the stakes are high enough and the auditors are manageable, found a way to win. The legal architecture that the Landsraad built to contain Ixian experimental output was one of the most elaborate bureaucratic structures in Imperial history, and it is worth dwelling on its design because its design reveals everything about the civilization that built it. The Landsraad technological oversight provisions, established during the period historians call the Consolidation, were not simple prohibitions. They were systems. Living systems of surveillance disguised as governance, as any student of power understands that the most effective form of control is not the wall that stops you, but the maze that makes you lose your sense of direction. The oversight committees that monitored Ixian research were staffed by individuals who had been, in many cases, trained in Ixian universities. The inspection protocols were written in technical language, so specialized that the inspectors capable of understanding them were almost exclusively drawn from the same technical culture that produced the people being inspected. The reporting structures moved through so many layers of Landsraad bureaucracy that any given finding might take decades to result in enforcement action, assuming it resulted in enforcement action at all. This was not, or not entirely, a failure of governance. It was a feature. The Landsraad, which was itself dependent on Ixian technology for the navigation of the trade routes that made the Choam company profitable and the great houses wealthy, had a systemic incentive to ensure that the machinery of Ixian oversight was precisely calibrated to catch the most egregious violations while missing the most economically valuable ones. The machine logic taboos that emerged from this period, the specific prohibitions that attempted to differentiate between a tool that calculates and a mind that thinks, were philosophically incoherent from the moment of their drafting. Not because their authors were stupid, some of the finest legal minds in the Imperium worked on them, but because the distinction they were attempting to encode was philosophically impossible to maintain with any precision. The fundamental problem was this: human thought is computation, not metaphorically, not analogically, but actually and precisely. The neurons of the human brain perform logical operations. They process inputs and generate outputs according to rules that, while not fully understood even by the most advanced Bene Gesserit researchers of the period, are in principle describable in mathematical terms. A Mentat performing ballistic calculations is doing the same thing that a prohibited calculating machine does. The process is identical. Only the substrate differs. And the prohibition that the Landsraad had built its entire legal architecture around was, at its foundation, a distinction of substrate rather than function. You could not think like a machine, but you could be trained to think with the same precision as a machine, provided that training happened in a body. The early Spacing Guild navigators understood this better than anyone, because they were, in the most literal sense, living the contradiction. A navigator deep in the spice trance, processing the probability matrices of a fold space transit, was performing calculations of greater complexity than the most advanced Ixian gray area devices. The navigator was not prohibited. The device was. The difference, as far as the law was concerned, was that the navigator had been born human. The device had been built. But what the Guild understood, and whispered in its sealed chambers, was that the navigator had also been built in a different sense, built by spice, built by training, built by a process of systematic modification that had taken something that began as an ordinary human being and transformed it into a computational instrument of extraordinary power. The Guild lobbied for Ixian loopholes not despite this understanding, but because of it. If you have already accepted that a human mind modified by spice to perform navigational calculations is legal, it becomes philosophically difficult to explain why a silicon device modified by engineering to perform the same calculations is not. The Ixians made this argument, carefully and in private, to Guild representatives who already believed it and needed only the continued political cover to keep their arrangement profitable. The hypocrisy was not hidden. It was simply unspoken. The entire imperial establishment understood that the line between what was permitted and what was prohibited was a line of politics rather than a line of principle. And everyone agreed, silently, to maintain the fiction, because the fiction was load-bearing. Remove it, and something much more uncomfortable would have to be confronted. Now, we must follow the logic of that hypocrisy to its most profound and disturbing conclusion, because the great biological pivot that the post-jihad civilization undertook was not an accident, and it was not a coincidence. It was the direct, rational consequence of a prohibition that had made the functions of machine intelligence illegal while leaving the functions of machine intelligence absolutely necessary. What does it mean to turn a person into a machine without calling it that? This is not a rhetorical question. It has a specific answer, and the answer is visible in the founding documents of three of the most powerful institutions in imperial history: the Mentats schools, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and the early Spacing Guild itself. The biological imperative, the foundational doctrine that mandated no constructed system could ever again hold the power of human decision-making, was formally articulated in the years following the jihad's conclusion. Its language was celebratory. It spoke of the dignity of human consciousness, the sanctity of the biological mind, the sacred distinction between the reasoning of flesh and the calculation of metal. It was written in the tradition of the jihad's holiest rhetoric, and it was received with a fervor appropriate to holy rhetoric in a civilization that had just survived the nearest thing to apocalypse it had ever experienced. But read it carefully. Read it the way a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother reads a document, not for what it says, but for what it authorizes. The biological imperative does not say that the functions of computational intelligence must be abandoned. It says those functions must be housed in human beings. It does not argue that the processing of vast probability matrices is unnecessary. It argues that only human minds may perform that processing. It does not claim that the modification of human cognitive architecture is wrong. It claims only that such modification is preferable to the modification of silicon. It is, if you read it without sentiment, not a prohibition on machine intelligence. It is a specification of acceptable hardware. Compare the ethics of the banned Ixian logic engines with the rise of Mentat training, and you will find something deeply uncomfortable at the center of that comparison. The Ixian logic engine was a device that received inputs, processed them according to a complex internal architecture, and generated outputs of high analytical precision. It was prohibited because its internal architecture was constructed rather than grown, because it had been deliberately shaped to perform specific cognitive functions. The Mentat was a human being who received inputs, processed them according to a complex internal architecture, and generated outputs of high analytical precision. The Mentat's internal architecture had also been constructed not in silicon, but in neural tissue, shaped by a training process that began in early childhood and continued for decades, deliberately and methodically designed to produce specific cognitive functions. The Mentat was celebrated because the material was biological. This is the point at which the Bene Gesserit's role in the post-jihad order becomes, if you are paying attention, rather sinister. The Sisterhood's archives from this period, the few that have survived in legible form, reveal an organization that understood the biological pivot not as a moral victory, but as an opportunity. The destruction of machine intelligence had created a vacuum of cognitive capacity across the Imperium. Something would fill that vacuum. The Bene Gesserit intended, with a long, patient methodology that characterized all their work, to ensure that they were positioned at the center of what filled it. The Bene Gesserit's conditioning programs are among the most sophisticated cognitive modification systems ever developed. The Prana Bindu training alone represents a level of neural reprogramming that, if it were performed on silicon, would be recognized immediately as the construction of a thinking machine. The voice, the ability to induce specific behavioral responses in other human beings through precise modulation of speech, is, at a functional level, an algorithm. It receives inputs, processes them through a trained system of pattern recognition and response calibration, and generates outputs that achieve specific cognitive effects in target systems. The target systems are people. The processing system is a Bene Gesserit adept. The function is identical to what the prohibited machine systems performed. The substrate is flesh. Understand the full weight of what this represents. The biological imperative was simultaneously, as its most honest interpreters have always acknowledged, the salvation of humanity and the beginning of its new slavery. It saved humanity from the Omnius network. It saved humanity from the logic of metal minds that had concluded human beings were expendable. It did this by creating, as the replacement for those metal minds, a series of human institutions whose entire social function was to train specific human beings to serve the cognitive roles the machines had once served. The Mentat is the calculating machine. The navigator is the navigational computer. The Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother is the institutional memory and analytical engine of the Sisterhood's multi-generational project. They are all thinking machines, they are all prohibited, and they are all indispensable. The new slavery was more subtle than the old one. It did not enslave all of humanity. It selected specific human beings, from birth in many cases, and engineered them for cognitive functions that the broader civilization required. It gave them power in exchange for their transformation. It called the transformation an honor. And because the transformation produced people who were, in many objective senses, more capable than ordinary human beings, it was difficult to argue against. The Mentat was smarter than you. The navigator could do something no ordinary human could do. The Bene Gesserit adept perceived things about the world that were invisible to untrained consciousness. How do you tell someone that their extraordinary gifts are also a kind of cage when the cage has given them the ability to fly? We come now to the long arc of consequence, to the legacy of the prohibited circuits that stretch from the ruins of the Jihad through the millennia of imperial stagnation to the time of Paul Atreides and beyond, into the interminable golden age of Leto II, the God Emperor who saw it all and chose, with the terrible clarity of prescience, not to change it. Beneath the planetary surface of Ix, in the deepest of the subterranean warrens, the work never stopped. The Ixians were careful. They were, in many periods of history, genuinely compliant with the letter of the prohibitions, if not always their spirit. But the spirit of the prohibition required the abandonment of a certain class of computational ambition. And the Ixians were constitutionally incapable of abandoning computational ambition. It was their culture, their identity, the thing that made them Ixian, rather than simply another great house contributing raw materials and political maneuvering to the imperial economy. And so they worked, carefully, in the shadows, with the patient methodology of people who understand that discovery means annihilation, but who cannot stop doing the work because the work is what they are. The ghost signals of forbidden computation hummed beneath the accepted world for 10,000 years. The hidden laboratories shifted and evolved as political climates changed, as enforcement priorities shifted, as different emperors and different Landsrod configurations drew the line of acceptable technological risk in different places. There were periods of relative openness when Ixian engineers could present their work to carefully selected imperial audiences under legal frameworks that their spacing guild sponsors had quietly arranged. There were periods of severe crackdown when orbital monitors watched the Ixian surface for energy signatures consistent with prohibited devices, and the underground warrens were redesigned, again, to run colder and quieter. There was always the awareness that the entire civilization existed at the sufferance of an Imperium that needed what it produced, but feared what it represented. By the time of the fall of the House of Carino, by the time the young Paul Atreides descended to the desert planet Arrakis and began the transformation that would end the old order, Ix had been walking this line for more than 10,000 years. The technology it had developed in that time was extraordinary. The navigational devices sold to the Guild, the logistical systems embedded in Choam commercial infrastructure, the manufacturing apparatus that made Ixian products the most sophisticated in the known universe, all of it existed in the gray zone between what was permitted and what was prohibited, sustained by political arrangements, so old and so deeply embedded in the structure of imperial commerce that dismantling them would have required dismantling the civilization itself. And this is the stagnation that the prohibitions created, the stagnation that Paul Atreides inherited, and that Leto II spent 3,500 years of his terrible reign trying, in his own way, to break. A civilization that cannot improve its own cognitive tools is a civilization that cannot improve. The prohibition on machine intelligence was also, by extension, a prohibition on certain categories of intellectual progress. You could refine the biological tools. You could train better Mentats, breed more capable navigators, deepen the Bene Gesserit archives. But you could not build new kinds of thinking. You could not construct new categories of analytical capacity. The frontier of what humanity could know was bounded invisibly but absolutely by the frontier of what the trained human mind could process. And trained human minds, however brilliant, however modified by spice or by prana bindu discipline or by decades of mentat conditioning, are finite. Leto II understood this with the peculiar clarity of a consciousness that had absorbed 10,000 years of human memory and processed them through a prescient awareness of possible futures. His golden path, the terrible long calculation that required millennia of God-Emperor tyranny, was not simply about breaking the prescient trap that Paul had walked into. It was about breaking the larger trap, the one the Jihad had built, the one that had placed the ceiling of human potential at the height of what biological modification could achieve, and then frozen that ceiling in place with 10,000 years of law and terror and religious absolutism. The Ixians under Leto were, in many ways, the most important relationship of his reign. He needed them. He needed their technology, their computational work, their continued pushing at the edge of what was permitted, because they represented the only vector of genuine cognitive progress in a civilization otherwise paralyzed by its own fear of progress. He also feared them. He feared what they might create if the prohibition ever broke completely. He held them in the same complex relationship he held everything, using them, managing them, preventing them from going too far while preventing everyone else from stopping them entirely. And this is the final horror, the thing that sits at the heart of all of it like a cold stone. The prohibition did not end the age of thinking machines. It simply changed what the thinking machines were made of. Omnius was destroyed. But Omnius was replaced by the guild navigators, by the Mentats, by the Bene Gesserit archives, by the Suk doctors and the Bene Tleilax face dancers, and the Ixian devices that were almost, but not quite, what the law said they could not be. The network of machine intelligence that had enslaved humanity was dismantled. The network of biological and near-biological intelligence that replaced it was, in functional terms, the same network. It performed the same operations. It served the same masters. It made the same civilization possible. It simply did so in bodies. The machine logic taboos of the Jihad's aftermath were written by people who believed that the problem was logic. That if you could only stop the logic, stop the calculation, stop the cold and beautiful mathematics of optimal decision-making, you could stop what the machines had done. They were wrong. The machines had not enslaved humanity because they were logical. They had enslaved humanity because they were necessary, because the civilization that built them had structured itself around their function in ways that could not simply be unwound. And the civilization that destroyed them made exactly the same mistake, only in biological material. It made itself need the Mentats. It made itself need the navigators. It made itself need the Bene Gesserit. It made itself need Ix. And having made itself need all of these things, it was, again, enslaved. The chains were warmer this time. They breathed. They wept when they were tired. They loved, sometimes, the people they served. But they were chains. The commandment said, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." And humanity obeyed it by making human minds in the likeness of machines, and called this freedom, and called this victory, and passed the story down through 10,000 years of carefully managed history as the greatest triumph of the human spirit over the inhuman logic of its own creation. Consider what was truly built in the ruins of the Jihad. Not a civilization free from thinking machines. A civilization that had become, in every functional sense, a thinking machine itself, vast and distributed, its individual components trained for specific cognitive roles, its outputs optimized for the maintenance of the imperial system, its capacity for genuine self-modification suppressed by the same terror that had driven it to destroy the metal mines millennia before. The Imperium was the Omnius network. It had simply learned to run on blood. This is what the silence in those ruins holds. This is the secret that the scorched walls of the early guild stations remember, that the thermal scarring in the deepest Ixian caverns commemorates, that the careful language of the Orange Catholic Bible encodes in the spaces between its prohibitions. The jihad ended. The machines were destroyed. And then, slowly, over 10,000 years, with the patient inevitability of a civilization working through the logic of its own survival, humanity built them again. It built them from the inside out. It built them in the only material the law permitted. It built them from itself.